Welcome to When the Holidays Hurt, how to support ourselves and others through grief, including loss associated with substance use, addiction, and overdose. My name is Merlene Tucker, and I'll be running today's web forum along with my colleague Jeff Bornstein. This web forum is sponsored by the National Overdose Prevention Network and produced by Dialogue for Health, both programs of PHI Center for Health, Leadership, and Impact. Now let's meet the moderator for today's event, Amy Max. Amy is a senior program manager at PHI Center for Health, Leadership, and Impact, where she oversees the design, strategy, and continuous quality improvement of multiple public health programs and initiatives. She currently manages operations for the center's overdose prevention portfolio, including an annual accelerator program for local overdose coalitions and the National Overdose Prevention Network, which provides training, resources, and learning opportunities to more than 6,000 leaders nationwide. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much, Merlene, and thank you everyone for joining us for our final NOPN webinar of 2025. We are excited to have you join us. Today, we're going to be talking about when the holidays hurt and how to support ourselves and others through grief associated with substance use, addiction, and overdose. And grief isn't just bereavement. It is experienced in many types of life events where we feel a sense of loss. That could include things like losing our job, a relationship ending, or sending a kid off to college. Grief is also felt when we are caring for and supporting folks experiencing substance use, addiction, and overdose, as we know many of you are. When we experience loss, the holidays and major life events can be a real challenge. We may need to adjust our expectations, think through how we process emotions, and even create new traditions moving forward. It's a lot. Today's session will explore why the holidays are difficult for grievers and what actions we can take to help someone living with loss. We'll talk about what is helpful and what isn't when we are supporting those we care about and work with who are facing the intersection of the holidays and challenges related to substance use, dependency, and recovery. And we'll offer some practical ways to show up for folks we care about, including ourselves. So let's get started with some housekeeping. Next slide, please. We first want to thank our funder, the California Department of Healthcare Services, for supporting our work here at NOPN and for today's event. And on the next slide, the ideas today are reflect those of our presenter and not of our funders. If you're not familiar with us, NOPN is run by our team at the PHI, or Public Health Institute Center for Health, Leadership, and Impact, or CHLI. We are a public health do tank that helps individuals and teams transform their vision into data-driven strategies. By cultivating leadership, catalyzing learning networks, and strengthening cross-sector partnerships, we create equitable, lasting impact in communities. Since 1991, almost 8,000 leaders in 53 states and territories have applied our tools and processes to address a wide range of issues, including overdose prevention. So be sure to check us out at healthleadership.org. Our National Overdose Prevention Network, or NOPN, is a national learning community. We support local, regional, and statewide overdose prevention efforts that draw communities together to save lives. Our goal is to help those doing the work on the ground, such as yourselves, share lessons learned and get inspired by new strategies. So please be sure to check out our website, nopn.org, for resources. And if you're not already on our monthly digest, please go to the website, nopn.org, and sign up at the bottom of the homepage. We'll start with some poll questions just to see who's in our national audience, and then we'll get going with the presentation, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So please make sure you enter your questions into the Q&A panel throughout the presentation so our speaker can answer your questions at the end. For our learning objectives, participants will be able to apply practical supportive strategies, including what to do and what to avoid when showing up for people experiencing grief, particularly at the intersection of loss, substance use, challenges, and recovery. You'll be able to describe why holidays and major life events can intensify grief and recognize common emotional and behavioral responses among individuals experiencing loss during these times. And you will identify multiple forms of grief beyond bereavement, including losses related to employment, relationships, caregiving, and experiences connected to substance use, addiction, and overdose. So now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Karen Lane. Karen is the program manager and one of the trainers for Cypress Resilience Project. She brings many years of experience in corporate, higher education, and nonprofit organizations to support the overall operations of Cypress. Outside of her work with Cypress, Karen has been in the field of hospice for more than 8 years as a volunteer, providing direct support to patients and caregivers, and serves as a co-facilitator of grief loss groups. She has also served for several years as a volunteer crisis counselor at two Bay Area County crisis hotlines. Karen received her BA in Human Development from Cal State East Bay, and she's a certified mental health first aid instructor, certified QPR instructor, and a grief recovery method specialist. We are so pleased to have you today with us, Karen. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you so much to NOPN and Dialogue for Health for inviting us to be here, for inviting Cypress Resilience Project, which is a program I work with here at Public Health Institute, to be a part of this conversation. And I have to say, I was really appreciating the polls, and I really love and appreciate that there are a lot of folks here who have some knowledge, but not a lot, and some who have a lot of knowledge and experience with the topic of grief and loss. And I am just, I want to just say that the opportunity to come and be a part of this conversation with all of you. We have been involved with NOPN and COPN and Dialogue for Health for a number of years, and the work you do is just I can't even imagine how challenging it is to do the work you do, and yet it's such critical work and critical roles that you play. And I recognize that you all are navigating a lot of challenges around loss and grief on a regular basis. And so I'm really grateful that that Dialogue for Health and NOPN brought this topic up as an option for the end of year. And I saw a lot of you hadn't attended a webinar before, so maybe that's good for me. Maybe that helps a little bit, so you don't have anything to compare it to, right? So that's what I'm going with today. How about that, Amy? Go ahead, next slide, please. Yeah. So as Amy said, that this is really about, we do structured this at this time of the year because, holiday season, and whether these are holidays that you celebrate or not, but holidays and life events, right? They bring extra stressors to us, right? And when you're already navigating some of your own challenges, you're already struggling with some kind of loss, whatever that loss may be, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Adding the stressors of holidays and expectations that come with that, or a life event, can really amplify that, right? And can amplify that loss and the challenges around that grief. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come together and have this conversation. Next slide. Um, Always like to start with a quote, and this one really speaks to, I think, the impact of loss on all of us, right? None of us is going to get through this life without some kind of loss, and some of us are experiencing that far more than others. But this quote by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, as many of you may already know, is the person who sort of the founder of the 5 stages of grief, right, on death and dying. And it's just beautiful because it's just a reminder that the most beautiful people we have known are those who known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of those depths. And when you're navigating some kind of grief and loss, as you all know, it can feel like it will never get better, right? It can feel like you will not come out of it. And yet we know that loss and change is a part of life, and we can't have growth without letting go of something else and letting go of something and having some kind of a loss there, right? So love to start out with this. And it's also a reminder for me, and I want to just sort of say this to all of you. I know you all are the subject matter experts in the work that you do. So I am relying on you to sort of take what we're talking about today and really think about, like, how does this really apply to the work I do, the people I'm supporting, but not just in your professional life, but also in your personal life. Because sometimes, right, it's hard enough to support people in our professional life, even harder in our own personal life. And how do you support yourself as you're navigating loss and grief? And the work you do, I imagine the work you do, you are constantly holding that grief and loss from the people that you are supporting and working with, whether that's a direct loss of that individual to death or an overdose or a suicide, or just simply holding some of their grief as they are trying to work through their process and their recovery, right? So that's a lot for you to be holding. And sometimes it's hard, we don't even notice that we're holding it, right? And the importance of this workshop is, in this webinar really, is to call some of that out, to name some of that, and to elevate it so that we can provide some approaches and some reminders of how can we support ourselves, how can we support others, and what are some of the key things we want to think about. So for some of you, this will be a bit of maybe a refresher, and maybe there'll be some new bits of information, new ways of thinking about loss that might be helpful and that you might take away from this. And for others of you, maybe some of this will be a lot of new information. Either way, I hope you find that this conversation feels supportive and feels like it gives you some tools to move forward as we sort of navigate certainly the rest of this year, but continue on in the work you do. So next slide. And so along those lines, I want to recognize, right, everybody comes into this, you all have lived experience, and that this conversation around loss and grief can feel like a difficult discussion on any given day. So just want to recognize that and just say to you, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself as we go through this conversation, but also as your day continues on, right? Because it may bring up some feelings, emotions, and things that you might not have anticipated that are like, ooh, where did that come from? So just really pay attention to that and be mindful and supportive of yourself. Okay. Plus, I really love this picture of a tiger. It's really a really impactful and beautiful, beautiful image anyway. Next slide. Thank you. So some of the way that we frame Cypress, the way we frame the topic around grief and loss and how we really define loss, it really is born out of the grief recovery method. We're not going to be doing the grief recovery method here, but that's really where this is coming from. And just quickly, the grief recovery method, it really is this sort of tangible tool. It's like it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it really gives some concrete steps for how to complete some unresolved emotions and grief surrounding a loss in your life. And for a lot of people, this can be a really effective way to manage and to navigate grief and to process those emotions. That's offers a little bit of a different approach than maybe talk therapy might. But so when we get to the next slide and the next few slides, you'll start to see how we start to define loss and really expand that definition of loss. Okay, next slide. So we start with sort of this foundation of like defining grief, right? How is grief defined? And so I just want to also call out, if you were to Google grief or grieving, you'll notice that the language that's used is really around, extreme anguish, sadness, and around the loss due to a death. And so we're going to expand that definition of loss a little bit in this conversation. But first and foremost, we want to acknowledge that grief is a natural and normal reaction to loss. Hard stop. Natural and normal reaction to loss. There's a lot of messaging that we get that tells us that it's not okay to grieve, or that we have to grieve in a certain way, or it's not that we can only grieve for a certain length of time. Those messages are coming from a number of different sources, right? A lot of times the way we grew up, a lot of times there is a lot of times it's the way, just got sidetracked by a question. A lot of times it's the way we grew up, the culture that we are from. There are messages that we get that tell us what is maybe acceptable, what is not acceptable way to grieve, and we really we take that in, right? And so we know loss is a part of life, but when we're not able to really work through that grief and then complications around that can really contribute to some challenges that we have later on. And there's been research that's been done that shows that significant loss and grief complications can be a contributor to substance use and dependency. And I'm not telling you something that you don't already know, because I think that, imagine the people that you're working with, the folks that you work with, right, that they underneath what they are dealing with is a ton of loss. You'll find a lot of loss and grief that hasn't been addressed. And frankly, who wants to address the feelings of grief, right? They're painful. That's something that most of us don't really want to do. So processing grief is something that is really hard to make ourselves sit down and do. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about loss. What are some of those losses? So let's go to the next slide. So when we think of, again, if you were to Google it, losses have that really tangible, if you were to Google grief and loss, you're going to see something around loss due to death. You're going to see, sadness, anguish. But we recognize that there's a lot of different types of losses, right? This list is certainly not comprehensive, but as you think about it, you may think of some others that you might add as other types of losses that someone might grieve. Some of these are very much like a life event, certainly a death, the loss of a job or a career, loss of a relationship. In the work that you're doing, somebody that is in recovery, right? There is a loss of their substance use, right? Or their substance or drug of choice. There's a loss there that they might be experiencing. And that is something that is real and may need to be grieved. There is that sense of an empty nest, right? The kids have gone off to college, and while there may be some happiness there, there's also a recognition that there's something, everything has changed, right? There is a deep loss there. Yeah, I'm seeing somebody put something in. I see a death of a pet, 100%. Yeah, death of a pet is not something that's on there. There also then are more intangible losses, right? And sometimes those are harder to identify. We can point to the loss of a job or finances or a relationship, but it's harder to really identify those other intangible losses, like a sense of purpose, a sense of loss of hopes and dreams, loss of our self-worth, or loss of a sense of safety. Right? Those are oftentimes harder for us to identify when they've happened, and certainly harder for us to, I think, even name what we're feeling and experiencing. And so when we are in a place where we are maybe supporting someone else, oftentimes we're able to those notice some of those more intangible losses that someone might be experiencing. So we may be able to say to them, "Hey, I wonder if what you're feeling and experiencing right now is because you're feeling a sense of a loss of a sense of safety." And if we can call out what those losses are and identify them as something we need to grieve, it at least gives us a chance to start the process of grieving. Yeah, loss due to independence due to illness. Yeah, exactly. Loss of a physical ability, loss of cognitive ability. Yeah, this list can be quite lengthy. And the reality is that someone may not necessarily grieve. That may not rise to the level that someone feels like they need to grieve or has that level of emotion of intensity. But oftentimes there can be just this sort of underlying sense of like something doesn't feel right. I'm struggling with something and I'm not sure what that is. Yeah. All right, next slide. So, continuing to define grief, we said it's a natural and normal loss reaction to loss. We also talk about it in terms of that grief is a conflicting feelings that's caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So, when you think of conflicting feelings, think about what are some of those feelings that might rise up for you. Again, typically we would think in terms of some sadness, which is what we often think of when we think of grief or bereavement. But it is much more complex than that, right? So there's a lot of other types of feelings that someone might feel, and it may be depend on the type of loss that it is. So sadness for sure, anger or blame, right? We hear that a lot due to the death of someone that they've left me behind, or potentially from someone who has a death due to an overdose, right? There's can be some blame, like you didn't take care of yourself, you made these decisions. So there can be those kinds of feelings that someone is navigating in the loss that they're experiencing in that grief. There can be a sense of relief, right? And oftentimes what comes after the relief is a sense of guilt, like it's not okay for me to feel that way, right? Um, so there's a lot of in our grief at any point in time, we may be feeling all of these all at once. So we raise this up because it's important to acknowledge that when we're supporting someone or feeling it ourselves, that it's may not just be sadness. And so leaving space for that and to acknowledge that yes, no wonder you're feeling all these things. You're grieving, and it's okay to feel frustrated. It's okay to feel anger. It's okay to feel blame. It's okay to feel relief. These are all okay to feel, and they're very natural and normal reactions and responses, right? Then the other part of that is the change. It's caused by the end of our change in a familiar pattern of behavior. And we just talked about that with some of the losses that we talked about. So we're letting go, like, and that's what, when we talk about, growth, we're letting go. Something has to change. We're letting go of a pattern of behavior, a way things were. So that is a natural part of that process. And sometimes that conflicting feelings is maybe the change is something for good, but we're still feeling a little sadness, right, around what we're having to let go and lose. Okay, next slide. And then the last couple points I want to make around this as we think about how we are defining grief, right, and how we are looking at losses, is that grief can be defined as the feeling of reaching out for someone or something that has always been there, only to find when you need them again, they're no longer there. Okay. And so we talk about this also in terms of if someone is maybe has certainly in terms of death or if loss of a relationship, but also too if someone is has some cognitive changes like dementia. This is often a feeling of that person isn't able to be there for you anymore, but they're still there, right? So there are a number, I imagine you can think of other instances where this might be the case, right? Where someone that has always been there for you is no longer there for you. And in the work you do, I can imagine maybe that also looks like a family member that isn't there to support you anymore or is no longer able and willing to offer that support. So that support system is no longer there. So that can look like a lot of different things for each person. But it's important to recognize that there is a loss there, right? That you may be grieving. Yeah, I'm seeing some folks put in the chat going, no contact with their family. Yeah, that is part of it, right? They are no longer there. They can't be that support for you. Yeah. So then let's go to the next slide. So I just want to call this out when we think about that, reaching out for someone or something that has always been there for you and is no longer there. So in the work you do, one of the things they talk about around the grief and loss related to the recovery process is that it is normal for a person in recovery to grieve the loss of their substance of choice. And I'm guessing that you have some knowledge around this. And for someone who doesn't have experience with this type of work, with the field of substance use and dependency and recovery, that can be a really hard thing for them to grasp or understand. But it is an important point to recognize and to call out and to leave space for, because that's really to process that is going to be really critical, right, to someone's continued recovery and success. Next slide. Okay. Let's finish the definitions. I guess I'm kind of keeping an eye on the time because I want to keep us going. So as we think about, the sort of final way to think about grief and other ways that it might show up and losses we might experience is that we can also define it as grief is the feeling of reaching out for someone or something who has never been there, only to find that when you need them, they're still not there. And sometimes it takes a minute to think about, like, what would that even look like? Right. And so sometimes what we see is can be common when it is like an absentee parent or a relationship with someone who is active in their substance use. Right. So, and sometimes that's not something that we think about grieving. I will just share my own experience when I was doing the grief recovery method process to become an instructor. One of the things we had to do was go through the grief recovery process, grief recovery method process. And part of that is to select a loss to grieve, a loss that you haven't fully processed. And I realized after whatever it was, 45, 50 years of life, that the loss that I needed to grieve was actually a family member who fell into this category. They had never been able to be there for me in the way that I always needed them to be or wanted them to be. And I held hope and I held out for hope and expectations and dreams, those things we do, only to realize time and time again that person wasn't going to be able to be there for me. And that was something I realized that I actually had to grieve. that I actually had to grieve that loss so that I could start to process some of those emotions around that. Um, and I know some folks are putting in there about like, why are we expecting them to be there if they've never been there before, right? So like it's about kind of reconciling our hope, right? And I think that's a really important piece. Where is it that that's living within us? But if you're finding yourself in that kind of a situation or relationship, really step back. Like, is this realistic? Are these hopes that are realistic or not? And is this something that I need to figure out how to process those sort of the hope and expectation and wishes and dreams that I have for this and this relationship? Yeah. All right, next slide. Okay. So we talked about like defining losses and expanding that. We think about grief and types of losses we might grieve. I also just want to take a minute and talk a little bit about how does this impact us sort of physically, neurologically. And the reality is grief can have a very similar response. Our brain can respond to grief and loss as an emotional trauma. And so trauma, of course, is that exposure, sort of that being going through an event or a series of events or circumstances where there's a real or perceived sense of threat to our security, our safety, our mental, physical, emotional well-being. And that is something that we carry with us, as you all know in the work you do, right? That's something we carry with us throughout our lives. And if we're not able to address it and work through it, it will continue to be part of the way that we respond to things, right? So what happens in the brain when it's responding to a stressor, and our brain's job, as some of you may already know, right, is to make sure that to keep us safe, right? To make sure that it's always kind of keep an eye out for what are some of any kind of threats or, threats to our safety, security, well-being, and then activate, if it detects something, activate that survival response. And we hear about that survival response, that fight or flight response that we often hear folks talk about. Right. And that's sort of hardwired back into those early sort of hunter-gatherer days, if you will, right? When those threats for us were, truly life and death reactions that we had to have. So our brain still responds in the same way. And when it does that, right, the part of our brain that makes up that area is called the limbic system. That's the part of our brain that responds immediately when it detects any kind of a stressor that feels like it's a threat to our sense of safety and well-being. And it activates, sends out chemicals into our body so that we can be responsive, we can respond, right? So that's where you see the cortisone and that sort of flooded through our body so that we can have an immediate reaction. So our body can protect ourselves, right? It also means that the part of our brain where the executive functioning resides, that prefrontal cortex, the thinking, the reasoning, it's also where our short-term memory lives, where our empathy is functioning is from. That part of our brain is no longer fully engaged because our brain and our body are now in full like survival mode, right? That survival response is activated. When somebody is experiencing some kind of an intense loss or grief, the brain can respond in the same way. That survival response can be activated. And we may not even realize it, and they certainly may not realize it. And that sort of then means so you hear that, right? Oftentimes when people have experienced some kind of a loss, certainly due to death, especially a sudden death, or death of someone, a long-standing relationship, people will talk about the fact that they can't remember anything, right? They're in a fog all the time. They can't seem to make themselves do anything. And there is a reason for that, right? There's a reason for that. That's where some of that response is happening, that survival response is activated, and it is part of the grieving process for them. So our reactions are things like fight or flight, freeze, or we call it functional freeze, where maybe the person just pulls back and can't make themselves do anything. You might see that with somebody who's just, I can't, I know I have things I have to do. I can't make myself do anything, right? Then that response may also, we say fawn. A lot of us haven't really heard that phrasing, but fawn or appease. And what that looks like if somebody is navigating grief or loss. It might be that they spend all their energy trying to make sure that everyone around them is okay, right? And is happy. so that they don't have to turn and feel and experience their own grief. And somehow, if they can make others happy and if those around them are all taken care of, then somehow for them, they will feel like there is a level of safety, and they will feel like there's a sense of normalcy for them. So I don't know if that resonates for you as you think about, think about that in your own life, maybe in people you've known who have experienced some kind of a loss, or in the folks that you might be working with. But it's important just to recognize that there is actually something happening in our brains at that time when somebody is experiencing some kind of an intense loss or grief. Okay. So then, next slide. So that sort of speaks to the importance, right, of making sure that as much as we can, trying to resolve whatever we can, whatever parts of that grief or loss that we are able to do so. What happens, right? You see this a lot maybe in your own life or folks that you might be supporting, is that with each subsequent loss, right? Where the grief, maybe we're not able to fully resolve it, or process it or start to heal through it, our capacity to manage is just sort of diminished each time. So sort of that baseline level kind of keeps dropping each time, right? And that is probably not a surprise as you hear that, because that happens to us a lot in life, right? I think about sort of kind of the collective grief that I think a lot of us, especially those of you who have been working in community, have experienced. You think back to the pandemic. There was a lot of collective grief that I think people were navigating during the pandemic, both personally, but also in professionally, right? And then there was a little bit of recovery. And then, now we're in this place in time where there feels like there is more, we're back into a place of more collective grief. There's been a lot of impact, right, into the resources and how we're able to help people and how our policies are in the work that we do. And so we've been hearing organizations more and more talk about how they barely just started to get past and recover from the emotions they were feeling through the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic. And now they're feeling like they're hit yet again with another set of grief, and loss. And they're trying to figure out, like, I don't even know if I have it in me to continue to manage that, right? And I was going to say, I wanted to add into this, I was thinking about and I don't know if this resonates for any of you. One of the things that we often talk about is something called moral injury or moral distress. And I don't know if that's a term a lot of folks have heard of. And we hear this a lot from a lot of organizations that like folks that are doing the work you're doing, right? You're in community, you see the need, you have a want to help, you have so much compassion, you got into this work because it mattered deeply to you and you wanted to make a difference. And when you start to encounter challenges around, maybe some institutional barriers or policies or, lack of resources that are needed to be able to do the things that need to be done, where it almost feels like your hands are a little bit tied. Sometimes there is a grief that comes with that. There's a loss there. There's a grief in that you can start to feel like, I don't know, powerless, right? You don't have control. You're maybe inadequate. Your frustration or guilt associated with that because you feel like you should be able to do more. You should be able to help more people and make a difference. And yet there are things out of your control. And that's something that we talk about with organizations, which is around the impact of that moral distress or moral injury, and how that can easily lead to burnout in the work that you're doing. And so being able to call that out and start to find some coping strategies for it can be really critical in being able to continue to maintain not only your well-being, but your ability to continue to do the work that you believe in and you want to do. So I don't know if that resonated for some folks or not. I saw a few little hearts, but think about that, because sometimes we are so busy doing the work you do that you may not even take the moment to notice that or understand that maybe that's what I'm feeling and experiencing. Okay, so all of this by way of saying there's a lot of loss that we're all navigating, and there's a lot happening. And we take a collective breath. And so now we add in another stressor, which is the holidays, right? Or life events. So next slide. Um, when I say holidays, holidays can mean anything, right? Any holiday that you might celebrate, or a life event. With those, right, they tend to, even under their best circumstances, even when we are at our best, they are stressful, right? They add another layer of stress to us. So, when we are navigating some kind of loss or we're in some stage of our grief, it just is another stressor that may be more than what we're able to handle. And so some of those things, right, like just at it on its highest level, when we talk, we're doing this week, this time of year, right? Because, certainly here in this country, right, it's the holiday season. Whether it's a holiday you celebrate or not, it's the holiday season, right? We can't go anywhere without hearing, music, right? Christmas music. And even if it's not something, a holiday you celebrate, there's an implication in that music and the energy and what we see on social media and the ads, right? Of what? Happiness, joy, togetherness, giving. There is, the messaging is of experiences and feelings that when someone is grieving or navigating a loss, right, those feel completely unattainable. To be able to be at that place where you're actually able to feel and experience any of what it feels like you're supposed to feel. So there's a lot of added pressure. Yeah. So next slide. So let's talk about like what is that, some of those, let's call some of those out, right? So the expectations of happiness and joy may feel really unattainable and can start to lead to maybe a sense of failure or inadequacy or more withdrawal, because you feel like you can't participate or you don't know how, or you don't want to be the person who brings everyone down, right? Or is sort of the negative, in the space of that particular celebration. We know that family dynamics, right? Family dynamics are, all this is pretty powerful, right? And they may actually be an activator for unresolved trauma or grief. Social settings, right, may not be conducive, to recovery, right? It may be added risk, right, for an individual. And these are the kinds of things that happen at this time of the year or during a holiday or during a life event that's celebrated, right? There's potential to be around those who may judge us in a way that we maybe have tried to avoid, right? And I think they can also serve as a tangible reminder of the losses that we've experienced. This is especially true when we're experiencing the loss due to a loved one, to a death, right? It's a visceral reminder that they are not there as they normally would be, right? And so those are part of those are some of those stressors I think that the holidays can really bring about or a life event can bring about. And I'm seeing some folks, in the chat that somebody's talking about it's the most wonderful time of the year. Yeah, it doesn't feel that way, right? It doesn't feel that way, 100%. So how do you navigate that? So next slide. And so that sort of leads us to like tradition. When there's life events or holidays, right, there's often centered around some kind of a tradition, and that looks different for each person. And it could be family traditions, could be cultural traditions, right? And each holiday may have a different tradition that's celebrated. But recognizing that there's an expectation that comes with that. And what happens if the person who is, the holder of that particular tradition is no longer there, maybe this is the first year without them. What happens to that tradition? Do we continue it? Can we adjust them? What happens if the tradition is one that is, maybe it is something that a member of the family can no longer participate in or shouldn't participate in because it's not healthy for them? Can we adjust that? Can we modify that? Can we do it differently this year? And that's something that is sometimes it's hard to navigate because other family members or other individuals, weigh into that conversation. So we know that that can be also challenging. So, but keeping that in mind, traditions, maybe we can adjust them a little bit this year or modify them so that they feel, maybe a little more accessible and something that we can manage. Okay, next slide. So a reminder. So now we want to talk a little bit about like, what can we do? How can we support? Grief is a unique experience, period, right? It's unique for each one of us. Next slide. And it's a reminder that every relationship is unique. And when I say relationship, it doesn't just mean relationship to a person. It can also be whatever that relationship was to whatever was lost. So grief is unique. Every relationship is unique. So we may grieve the loss of, so if this like talk about a loss of a person, we may grieve the loss of one person, a death in one way, and a totally different grieve in a very different way the loss of someone else, right? Depends on what those relationships are. And two people may grieve this loss of the same person, the same relationship, in a very different way from each other. So it's really important to keep in mind we can't compare losses. We can't make a judgment. I mean, we want to try to not make a judgment about how someone else is choosing to grieve. And remember, when somebody's grieving, it may also be bringing up all of some of those traumas that they have been that they're processing that they have experienced in their prior life. That may also be complicating what the grief is that they're experiencing and how they're presenting it. Okay, next slide. So what can we do? So this is a good reminder, right? It's the elephant, it's the proverbial elephant in the room, right? So first and foremost, we can acknowledge the loss, there's been a loss of some kind. So we can call that out in whatever way feels most comfortable. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But acknowledge the loss. Also acknowledge that it can be really uncomfortable to be around someone who's grieving, right? And I think it's okay to call that out. Part of that is because we don't like to see, I think most of us, right, don't want to see somebody um, in pain. And when someone's grieving, we are not able to fix it. We can't cheer them up. We can't help expedite the grieving process. Right? And that can be really hard to sit with. And that can be really difficult. So acknowledging that is going to be really important for yourself. And then you can decide to set what boundaries do you need to set for yourself and what you feel like you're able to do and how you're able to be present. So we think about what we might say to someone. So think about, for yourself, start to think, what's the time you experienced loss? What did people say or do that wasn't helpful at the time? When we ask this question in groups and we have conversations, are able to have conversations around this, it's a lot of times what we hear are things like, don't cry or time heals all, right? And so the reality with time heals all, right? So first of all, grieving has no time limit, right? There's no time constraints on grieving. It may take as little or as long as it needs to take, okay? But time heals all. Time passes, but it's what you do with that time that makes the difference of whether or not you actually are able to start to heal through that grieving. Sometimes we hear like, yeah, but you have a lot to be grateful for. So I think about this in terms of somebody who has made some improvements. So I wonder, like for you, does this resonate for some folks that you're supporting who maybe are in recovery, right? Who are also still maybe grieving the loss of what they've left behind, right? All the things that they have lost, right? And that was a pretty lengthy list. And so others may be saying to them, yes, but you're on a good pathway, right? There's a lot to be grateful for. The thing is, it can be right? We can be grateful for what we have, and we can still be sad for what we've lost. So it can be an and. It doesn't have to be an or. At least anything that starts with at least, right? Are you with me? Anything that starts with at least, not usually followed by anything that feels that's going to be helpful, right? I know exactly how you feel. Well, everybody's different. Everybody feels something very differently, right? So, we can say like, "Oh, I experienced a similar loss. Like, I know how hard that was for me. How was it for you? How hard has that been for you?" Okay. So, I'm going to try and avoid some of these. Sometimes it happens. I always like to think people are well-meaning. They really are trying. They really just don't know what to say. I don't know if that's always the case, but I try and give them the benefit of the doubt. So, next slide. What do we want to say? We sometimes think about it as being caring, consistent, and curious, right? So, we could start by just saying, like, I can't even imagine how hard this must have been, and leave that open and allow them to fill in that space. And acknowledging, if somebody shares something with you, thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for trusting me enough to share that with me. Being consistent, sort of like, that's the reassuring, it's normal to feel that way. Or I'm available. We can offer to be there in whatever way feels comfortable for us. And I think we need to be honest about what that looks like for each one of us. But a lot of times I'll say, listen, I'm available if you want to talk, vent, cry, express anger, whatever. I'm here for it, right? Or if you just want to sit and you want to sit and watch a movie together, we can do that too. Hey, is it okay if I check in with you once in a while? Give people a chance to sort of to have a voice in that. Ask for their permission. It makes it easier than to follow up with them after the fact. Yeah. Folks are saying in the chat some things that we can offer to help with, right? Identify what some of those are. What are some things that um, what are some of those things that we can offer that we think might be helpful and see if they're helpful for that individual? And I love that someone's putting in the chat, like, if you can't be there, if you cannot be there, if that's not something you're able to do, then don't offer that. So I love that you're making that point. Yeah. And be curious. So we can start to ask some questions like, hey, what do you miss the most about that person or whatever that loss was? And see if they leave space to see if they want to have that conversation or they feel like they want to talk about it. Okay. Next slide. And then thinking about, now what are some of the things we can do? And some of you had popped some things in the chat. I think one of the first things that can be really impactful is listen. Sometimes the tendency is, right, we want to fill the space. Maybe it feels awkward or uncomfortable, but we can listen and give them that space. As we listen, we learn more. And as we leave space, people will talk more oftentimes. Ask, don't assume. And what do we mean by that? Well, when we say ask, we mean give that person, don't make an assumption that we know what might be helpful or think what we are able to offer will be most helpful to them. Offer it. Ask if that will be helpful. Ask if it's helpful if I bring over a dish tomorrow night, some food tomorrow night. They may say, no, I have enough. It's going to be too much for me. We can then offer to do it another time. Ask if they want to talk about it. If they don't, that's okay. Leave space for that. But ask and don't assume allows them to have some sense of control at a time when they feel like they don't have any control over anything. Reassure and normalize. Let them know it's okay to be sad. It's okay to not be okay, right? And that's especially helpful at the holidays or life events, right? It's okay to be sad and it's okay to not be okay. And the other thing is sometimes too, especially for somebody who has experienced a loss is grieving a loss due to death, it's okay. Give permission. It's okay to laugh or have a moment of joy because sometimes there's a sense that there is I don't know, we're betraying the grief or betraying that person. We can limit our expectations of the person. Don't add too many additional expectations of them. Help them name their grief, right? We may be able to identify that they're grieving before they can. Help them name their grief and be aware of our own discomfort, right? Next slide. And I saw someone was asking a question about yeah, is it okay to give yourself permission to just be there for yourself? 100%. Yes, I agree. I think that's sort of the boundaries, right? So kind of speaks to what we were talking about before is like acknowledge your discomfort and also what you're able to do or feel like you're able to give and offer. And it's okay if you can't find ways to still support them. Maybe do a check-in once in a while, but create some boundaries there so that you're able to protect yourself and be there for yourself in that process. So a couple of other things, and then we'll do a quick look at how we can support ourselves. And I know we're getting up on time here, but these are things again anytime, but especially during a holiday or a life event, right? Help the person who's grieving and ourselves, right? Set realistic expectations of themselves through that particular life event or holiday. And maybe we can help moderate expectations from others. I love this one because it's like help them prevent a plan B or an escape plan, right? A coping strategy. Sometimes people who are grieving uh, a loss and they're deep in their grief, folks will invite them and include them. They may try and go, But on the day of, they may realize, like, I can't do this, or they may get there and realize they cannot handle it and they need to leave. So helping them to create a plan for how to step out or how to, what else to do on that day if need be. And it sort of leads into including them in activities, but don't pressure. So invite them, include them. If they don't come, invite them again. I'm seeing somebody put that in the chat as well. Yep, invite them again. It's okay, but don't pressure, and continue to include them. And then do more than those basic check-ins with that person. Can it keep being that, just even if it's just a quick text, just to let them know you're thinking about them, how you doing, you were on my mind, all of that makes a difference. Next slide. And then I think this is really powerful, which is a reminder that, we don't have to do all the right things. Sometimes we can just be present. And when we can create safe space for one another, that, it's just being together can have an incredibly positive impact on somebody's ability to heal. Next slide. So how do I support myself? Next slide. Okay, some useful strategies, okay? So again, I also want to just acknowledge all of this is hard, and it gets really hard when we're talking about supporting ourselves. So I just want to call that out. I didn't do that earlier. We want to be like, this is all hard, just hard stop, period. It is hard. So some things to think about for ourselves. Recognize that it's hard, right? Be patient. Again, no deadline for grief. Stay connected with those who don't judge, right? And set some boundaries with those who do. And sometimes the people who come and support you in your grief are not the people that you thought they would be. It's different people sometimes who come forward. So just know that. Set realistic expectations for yourself. Limit how many things you're trying to get done. Find other ways around. Change up a tradition if it requires too much work and time and energy for you that you don't have. Consider scheduling time to grieve, which sounds funny, but sometimes we need to take a moment to stop and actually grieve and feel the feels, feel the emotions we're feeling, even though it may be difficult and uncomfortable. And then get back to basics. How do we care for ourselves? All those basic things that we would tell somebody else to do. All right, next slide. I think it takes me to the end. I know that we ran a little, sorry, Amy, a little bit long. I want to just say, just a reminder to have compassion for ourselves, and that it's, grieving is a gift, actually is a gift we can give to ourselves, and that compassion for ourselves is a gift to ourselves during our grief and others. And this is all really challenging to do. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I am so grateful, and thank you so much for the work you all do. I just can't even imagine the challenges and what you all must be carrying in that work, and also in your own lives. So thank you. Amy, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was fantastic and so needed and important for so many of us right now. Um, Folks, we have in a resource list that we're sending out that Karen put together, the grief and loss resource list. Please make sure you click on that to download it. We do have an evaluation for today. We'd love to get your input and feedback. So please complete that, and we'll put that in the chat as well. What we have up on screen is more information about Cypress Resilience Project and Karen's team if you want to hear more. And then we have a workshop, a follow-on workshop. So if there's more that you want to dig into with Karen and do some more kind of hands-on work and conversation around this topic, please join us. It's going to be on Tuesday of next week from 10 to 12. We've got the link in the chat if you want to sign up and register. This will be a 2-hour workshop to really go the next step into this conversation and do some personal reflection for yourself and your own work with Karen facilitating. So again, please click on that link and register if you think you can join us for the workshop next week. Again, really appreciate you filling out the evaluation. Give us some more feedback and do download that resource list that Karen put together. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this important conversation. There's more on this conversation that will continue in 2026, but for now, we really appreciate you and are grateful for all that you do and the work that you do every day in your communities and saving lives. We know it's a lot and it puts a lot on all of you. So we appreciate you taking the time today to join this webinar and learn more about how we can take care of ourselves as well. So thank you, and more next time. Take good care, everyone.